But there was resistance against the military. And it came from the big unions, from organized labor, from the general range of the intelligentsia. But today, referring to NSAS, it appears that quantum of resistance from organized labor, from the general range of Nigeria's intelligentsia, has vanished. So it's a shame. No flux force, universal, immigration, atavism, and in fact, we're in a worse state today than when Ken was killed. That's how it was for now. Thank you.
We have not so much time to meet. Maybe also call Ralph after that. Let's hear from Ralph. Ralph.
Yes, everyone. Just like Brad, I'm sorry I joined in late, but I actually wanted to join in earlier. The meeting wasn't ready. The Zoom wasn't ready for me. I hope you guys can hear me very clearly. Over there. Hello? Hello? Enough? I'm taking a word from my friend here. Hello?
We can hear you now. We're not hearing you previously. Hello? Ralph.
Why is he on here?
I think he's having network problem. The connection.
Ralph, the network problem is not allowing you to get through to us. So let me, with two issues before us. The technical solution only last 25 years ago. Just like Chile has pointed out, 25 years after, all of the counter-insurgency method used by the state are very also at play. And they offer the revenue as a short
Hello?
I want to invite questions, contributions. I also like the different way in which you connected the NSAS protest to events of the region. Like we also pointed out, possibly NSAS were dangerous, even though like what they have pointed out Ken assumed was his personal.
But they need it, there's no problem.
But when it comes to power, crossing over and being on the other side and being somebody who is expected to defend the interests of the title in the elites, you must do your job appropriately. So Abacha knew how to do his job appropriately and will not allow question of friendship, relationship, and I think that's another key lesson for us when process of having a new Nigeria, struggling to bring it about. It requires that also learn one or two things from how those who keep this country like this. We must learn their strength of not giving up about their own negative ideas. By not giving up in spite of whatever we go through all of this process. Interestingly, I'm very glad to change the day again to now. Instructed and pointed out that we need to write our own narratives. We need to write our own history. Because the oppressor will only write history from his own point of view. Which is why in reading Kenneth, a month and a day, and reading Funmilayo's Jail for Life, we meet with what happened 25 years ago. Those books offer us windows in the partial years of Nigerian wars. What is going to offer us the windows into Nigeria of today? 25 years from now, how will we see the Black Tuesday? How do we see those events? Should we see that narrative as a basis of saying, no, the street and struggle is not something that can happen or should repeat itself? There are a lot of us who think that when September 28th occurred with the labor leaders, I prefer to use the word the labor programs, calling off general strike that was supposed to have come on for them. It means that the entirety of the working people practically also have no role to play. There are also key lessons also to be learned. At no time must we say that the labor leaders become synonymous with the entirety of all of the working people. I've had calls in other platforms to point out that by the 10th day of the end-start protest that has seen the character of the general strike, schools have been closed down, workplaces have been closed down. But there was the entire disadvantage and working people were not informed directly before the sense of the organization, sense of their demands, and sense of their program. There is a sense in which some others have said that without leaders, because when you look at the master movement without leaders, the ruling elite will just push them out of it. But the youth in their anti-staff protests were the leaderless structure that they were putting on. They're not from the point of listening to it. It was more from the lesson that the labor leaders have demonstrated that once you are in the leadership of a movement against the ruling elite, they will isolate the leaders, bribe them, and settle them out of the movement. That was the narrative, that created the leaderless movement. But again, too, we must also gather the lesson from that process. The movement against the ruling elite, who are older than 1960, older than 1940, who are centuries old, and have perfected their methodologies centuries and centuries over and over again. You can't go against those characters without a leadership, without an organization, without a clear program. A program that must also speak to the mass of the millions of the people themselves. And you can't go against the state without also not knowing character of the state. What is the state? What ideas puts us in a position to understand the role of the capitalist state? What is the police? What is the military? It is not accidental that we have a kind of police and military we have in a neo-colonial country like ours. So let me open up this floor for discussions and questions and views. Thank you very much. Yoni.
Good afternoon. My name is Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti. So, October this year, my best friend committed suicide. She studied abroad and came back to Nigeria to get started as an actor. But then on a daily basis, she started comparing Nigeria to the country she came back. She got depressed and committed suicide. After she died, she sat down to despair. We could not live with the pain and all of that. Of course, we've been talking about the whole thing before she decided to dish out this lot of confusion to us. Now here it is. My friends think, we should go our separate ways. Something like a peaceful separation in Nigeria. Since we've been believing in one big Nigeria that can live in unity and peace. So it's not working. Really, it's not working. The whole history of inhumanity, brutality keeps replaying. It's happened in Shinka's generation, it's happened in generation, it's playing out in my generation. How about we just, go desert in Ibadan country, Lekki country, Ataba country, country. What do you think? Of course, I told them immediately that there's still the politics, Whenever we have a place and there's a leader and there are followers, of course, there's still the politics. That means that does not really push out the bad ones, but then they feel it's better. And they gave me a very good example. The 5 girls, while we were growing, we did not live in peace. But now that everyone is separated, my sisters are married, now we miss each other. We just, meet each other once in a while, see each other during weekends, and we look at the what that's a year. It's sad.
Thank you very much.
Let me begin by saying that I'm a believer in Nigeria. And the reason I believe in Nigeria is because I believe in something bigger than Nigeria. I think that we need to look at history from a broad angle so that we don't miss the things that can save us because we are looking too closely at our own levels. I'm sure you know what I mean by looking at your own level. If you look at the map of Africa, you will discover that almost all the nations and nationalities have been interfusing, intermixing, and have been breaking up and reforming. But one thing has been very certain. All the black people who have lived right through up to the Mediterranean have been pushed down for centuries. They've been moving back down. Anybody who gets to the Mediterranean and enters Africa has an ambition. The ambition is to keep the story, the human story, the Quran, or whatever it is you consider most important, into the Atlantic Sea. And the Atlantic, getting into the Atlantic is passing through Nigeria. Almost all the nationalities in Nigeria tell us of how they moved from whether Iraq, Yemen, Palestine, or wherever it is, into Nigeria. And when you look at Africa, you discover that the movements from one part of Africa to the other, gradual movements. I mean, when you hear of the Ghana today, you don't really get to any to the level of Kenya or any of the other East African countries, but there was always a link. The movement from South Africa, from Nigeria to South Africa is unbelievable. They speak Edo in Zululand because the migration that pushed down to South Africa crushed the red-skinned people they met on the way before they got to where they are, South Africa. And then that movement between Zimbabwe moved right up again to modern Zimbabwe. But from modern Zimbabwe, another breakaway moved through the Cameroon mountains so that they joined the chief and the Junkos, who have literally taken over all the ethnic nationalities from east right through to Katsina. In fact, I remember his recent book saying that the Junkos up to today are to be found in about, I think, 21 of Nigerian statistics. There is no ethnic group in Nigeria. All of them are components of several ethnic groups brought together. But I've been saying it, and people have taken it to disagree with me. I've not taken all this so well. I can tell you, the Igbo and Yoruba were one people. They broke. When they broke, the Igbo, on their way to where they are now, actually had to pass through the Ghana and the Yoruba, which is precisely why the language that they took away from the West picks up the languages they found on the way. Most of them were taken into slavery, and but those slaves spread across all of the countries. When you read Kennedy, the historian will tell you how the various groups were named against either the land in which they lived, whether it was bleached, eroded or not, whether they were artisans or whatever. Now, the reason for telling you these stories is that there is no African group that has not intermixed with other groups. The Fulani speak a language that is exactly like that of the Igbo and the Yoruba. It doesn't sound true when you are listening to them, but write down the words from the dictionary, and the first thing that hits you is that they name the parts of the body the same way. They name very many things exactly the same way. They just pronounce them differently. Now, that tells you that they have been mixing for a very long time. Even if you break up Nigeria, that whole intermixture is locked into our system. We will always intermix. And if a people will always intermix, it means they need something extra. What we never had was this. Before that, we are always the same traders. They help trade the glass age into Libya, Mali, the Middle East, into Europe. The first thing you must ask yourself is, why we never had a land? So, what was part of the reason? They were looking for cattle routes and slave routes. They never stuck to the land. The Yoruba axis had a land and they stuck to it. The Yoruba moved first into the grouping and back country, returned. You will hear it said that their headquarters was in Africa. Africa is just over there. To know that the Yoruba had that sweep from that local axis down to where they are and shared even common needs. If you know Yoruba history enough, you will be told that Strong's mother was moving. The relationship between all of them is such that they cannot break. As you see, irrespective of how you break them up to date, they are simply going to come back to where they are. So the first thing you and I will be looking for, how do you turn neighbors into citizens? It is a question Nigerians have never tried to ask. How do you turn neighbors into fellow citizens? The very day we answer that question, we are home and dry. And what I will tell you is only one person has answered that question. His name is Aburo, and he has just waiting. Because what I will simply say is this. whatever there is in the world of knowledge, you can transfer it into all the knowledges in your own land. And all the knowledges in your own land, you can transfer them into the English language. You will equalize your relationship with the West. There will be no superiority complex by models. The only reason a European can claim to be superior to you is the knowledge they have acquired over the centuries. They did not acquire that knowledge by sitting in one place. They acquired the knowledge by moving from one part of the world to the other. All the West in the English language stolen from the Indians. Now, the English dictionary is acquiring many new words and turning them into English. Very soon, they are going to be using those words in a way that is no longer ours. But yes, we too have a chance to do it. That is to say, give education for our people. To give education to all Nigerians, the distinction between the various ethnic groups is blown. There is no way it can be, those distinctions can be maintained in the hard and fast manner when you give them common education. For instance, if a Fulani is properly trained as a physicist, he doesn't have to speak Yoruba, but he can build a power station in Yoruba. You don't need any of the same knowledge, whether in Fulani, Yoruba, or Kanuri, will be exactly the same. They are one to show the same leadership. If you give all of them a common set of education, they can work together as proper human beings. We allow Germans to come to Nigeria to build those schools. The Australia have been allowed for ages. What if we educate our own people so that they don't eat for themselves? This necessity for your people to build their own country is actually what it takes to make you and I masters of our own house. At the moment, it is a case of one ethnic group says, I want to conquer our duty and my duty is to beat them down to being citizens. Instead of their wanting to be overlord, we beat them into citizens. And I think that that fight is cheaper than the fight of trying to break government.
Thank you. A little bit more, since this is all about airtime. Much of this position, this household position, did he share? Did Kenta Global share? That's one. Or A, B, all your attempts to bring Kenta Global to the fold, yes, did not quite work. What happened? Why did that happen?
It's an interesting question because I've just written that part of the story.
You want to start saying?
No, at first, I met Sarowa for the first time when he came to see our work. I mean, I arranged the meeting, but I did not stay in the meeting. But when we finished, he just walked out and we started talking. And we started talking about everything and anything. Sarowa wanted to work with our, but they knew that our needed a national constituency. At that point in time, our had just decided that he was going to take the vice president, from the Igbo country. He was very president. Now, Mary was 6 lawyer, and I want to tell that if he took this lawyer as his deputy, he was likely to win over Zik to his side. But it didn't work out. But while Aurora was reaching out to Mary, Saruwiwa hated the idea of having to work under an Igbo echelon. He just thought it was undone, something he should not do. And the reason he felt it was something he should not do is actually evident when we meet many Igbo intellectuals talk about Saruwiwa. They talk about Saruwiwa like somebody who deserves to be slaughtered. Largely because Saruwiwa refused to work with them into Biafra. But you know the interesting thing is also this, that those who want into Biafra, if you ask them today, they are not able to tell you that they went to Biafra because of people in this state. All the generals who worked with the people did not want Biafra. Told him, we don't have ambition, we don't have food, we are not going to win this war. And the first thing he did, who was the head of the army, he took him going to detention. And anybody who was opposed to him, he then told him, Saruwiwa knew this was. Saruwiwa told me he would not. He said, I understand that well, but I can't understand them. And he would name all the people and said, how would they respond to the 500,000 strong company people insisting that they must have control of the resources around their deaths? To be very honest, up to 2020, no majority ethnic group I know relates to any minority group with the intention to let them go to their resources. None. The closest to the majority group that wants to do that are the Yoruba. But see what they did. When it got to the point where they really had to vote for a Niger Delta resource control program, they had this meeting at the Liberty Stadium in Ibadan and decided that no, they needed to postpone that part of the agenda because it wasn't political to immediately allow resource control. That is to say, some money from the oil producing areas needed to be given to other states to take care of certain things before we could allow resource control. If you ever allow a period of moratorium, which you think we must explain before we can have resource control, there have never been resource control. Anybody who is, I mean, we are discussing restructure. Anybody who is interested in doing resource control must abide by it as a determined fact. That is to say, we will fix a date and say, from this date on, the way that Japanese rounded he simply said, I have only 3 months to prepare to be governor. But on the day I become governor of this state, all the 3-shift system in schools will come to an end. Now that is the way to govern. That is the way to govern the people.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I also welcome my fellow advisor and take a difficult to 3 minutes and have a stake. So I want to take all that contributions. Follow your welcome.
Your time is up. Your time is up. Yeah, this is 10:26. We should have started the other one at 10 o'clock. What? What's going on? Yes. Hello.
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 Hello. That's me. Yes.
No, it's telling us to.
Yeah. That you scheduled another thing for 10 o'clock, right? That's 4 o'clock Nigerian time, and this is 10:27. and people are waiting to start the other session.
Yes, actually, because I really participate in this program via Zoom, but Germany existed. This was I have to be here. Coming from anywhere, and it's pretty traffic wasn't sorry, I'm not it. Yes, Ken Sarawa is one of us really. Especially he's coming from the Israeli community. He being a writer, a passionate one who showed as a crusader, which every writer, every serious kind of writer might want to be. There's something said about the fact that every writer is an activist in his own way, but he really went into activism besides the literary activity, and then took up the states, the governments, in the fight, in the fight towards having an egalitarian society where everybody will be free, everybody will be treated as equal, not one group looking down on others, thinking that they own the community while the others are tenants in their own land. And that was the main thing I saw. Besides the fact that he was a source of inspiration to a lot of us in his creative activity. Well, at the point he was president of Ghana, Nigerian authors, and he was really one that while there was a convention of annual national convention of Anna at the University of Lagos. That was the day it was really good. So, well, the thing for me, which I feel that any writing government leader should take away from this, is the fact that he was elevated in the hope that that struggle for emancipation of his people against the integration of his community of his land as a group would be killed, that the dream of that he stood for and which he fought for and which he was ready to actually remove his life up to for was yes, could be killed, and the 25 years down the line, we've seen that the agitation coming from the Niger Delta community, and the things that people fought for now, but then, back then, those things are still the struggle is still ongoing now, and there is still getting more serious. And then I think the ESA's protest, one thing that is this here, because the government or functionaries of the government have come out to say that the ESA's protesters have a point and they have a clash points and everything about yes. But in action, they're actually going about jumping out of mobilizers of the protest, and then so saying something and then doing something different. So I think it was in the news today about the jailing of 6 Nigerians outside Nigeria who were about to have been that was sponsoring Boko Haram. That's one thing that the Nigerian government hasn't been able to detect since all this time that Boko Haram has been attacking Nigerians. But it didn't take them days to really trace the accounts of the leaders of the SR's protests. So these are things that I think. So in trying to push, in trying to kill the spirit of the protest in the people, I think caution has to be taken so that it won't be escalated to what might not be uncontrollable in time. So I don't want to take too much of the time.
Thank you very much. We're already on the queue to round up.
Thank you, everybody. My question is, should we still, Saodia said he lives in Nigeria, she used to believe in Nigeria. He said something, he said 25 years ago, where were we? I was here born. And if I'm 22 now, and if 25 years ago we are fighting for the same thing that just last month we were still fighting for, she used to believe in Nigeria, like, she used to believe that it will all get better, or should we just make some cash and live in the country? I don't know, that's the question.
I don't know how to do it, but I get our point. The truth is, most of my friends are migrated, but then we all come from, that's the truth. So who's going to, and this sounds very cliche, but who's going to fix it? Imagine they run away. Not some of our generation, of course, left for Canada and some other places, but the truth is, in the end, there's a lot of rebuilding to do, and it has to be with us. Again, there's a lot of things around that will make us, that is enough to make us useful, but at the same time, I believe right now what happened last month, the truth is, this kind of thing has happened in a very long time. So there's a momentum, and thankfully there is social media now, which, well, we're to work with, walk around, but then God willing, it will happen. So people are not keeping quiet anymore. I mean, there was a move to recall one of the legislators last week. I mean, that usually doesn't happen. So like, there's a momentum, people are angry. The international community is listening. Hopefully, this doesn't end in tears. Hopefully, we make a headway with it. But like I said, there's a momentum now. Even if you leave your cousin, your brother, your sister over here, even if you are somewhere in Frankfurt or Munich or Bonn or Melbourne, you still think of it at home. So even if you are safe where you are, half of your heart is still at home because you still worry about them. You still think whether they'll fall into your manhole. So the reconstruction, rebuilding still lies because, like I said earlier, they have done their bit. It's up to us to what we have. And even those outside can also contribute to the nation building. What made these protests successful as long as it was before the massacre happened? Funds were flowing in from within, from outside. So even those who could not be there physically lent their voices as well. There is it looks very, it's like candle presidential.
Thank you very much. Just to have one to like, there is hope, a very beautiful hope. And that hope is to say that in what happened in those 11, 13, 14 days, Nigerians demonstrated first and foremost that they can be united.
Yes.
Kenny demonstrated that, which was why the elite came against him. The whole of Ogoniland was united. We are opposed to oil exploitation. That unity was demonstrated there. Nigerians no longer saw themselves as Igbo, Hausa, wherever they came from. They were united by their common sufferings against police brutality. And from the point of just raising the question of police brutality, people began to see all of the connecting dialectic thread into every other issues as to how society is governed. Because even within the rank and file of the police, I had a one-on-one session with the GPO a day before the Black Tuesday, and the man told me that the running cost for a police station in Nigeria was 5,000 naira. That the tear gas he has in his, the tear gas he has in his police station was brought there by the Shehu Shagari regime. And that if there is a protest outside, he can't bring that outside. The only thing he can take outside if there is a protest is his gun. So these are,
he has only 5 bullets.
These are existing facts. So yes, to become an Oduduwa, to become a Biafra, does not resolve the question of how society will develop. How? Because what we are all confronted is that how do we develop this society? What are those things that are needed to develop? And those questions of development does not exist in any of our language. They exist in all the body of ideas that humanity has produced already. Thank you very much.
We are the used generation. Used. Thank you very much. Please give a round of applause. Before we go, let me just say apology to speakers in the next session because they've been online and waiting. Most of them are outside of Nigeria. So the time difference is also. That's why I can't show up who's moderating the next session. But thank you very much, all the speakers. And I have to especially thank you for leaving a pen. But I said it would be so bad if there's no pen person on seat and you left a pen and they don't wait for so many hours. But thank you very much. The next session is starting immediately. The same is looked. So I'll just especially ask that you stand up, take a quick picture, and then just in 2 minutes. So, let's go. Please. Thank you very much. We don't need to the next session is Mr. Ayodele Curtis Joseph, his Centenary Memorial. And I don't know if I should do the introduction now, but there's only one speaker in the house, others are joining us virtually. That's the new norm that we are coming to. I don't know. And arguably, who wanted to get this?
Yeah, I'm here. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, depending on where your location is. But it's morning here. It's 10.
Which one has the mic?
What did you say?
Oh, okay. No, I wanted you to start.
Yeah, I started. I was basically saying good morning, good afternoon. Okay, all right. My name is Akin Adeshokon. I'm a Nigerian writer and scholar teaching comparative literature and cinema and media studies at Indiana University, Bloomington, Indiana. And I'm the this commemorative event is and bibliophile Peter Ayodele Curtis Joseph, who was born in Benin City 100 years ago this week. Our participants include established and emerging progressive activists and scholars such as Ladi Olorunyomi, the former chairperson of Women in Nigeria, Lagos branch, Said Husseini, currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Lagos, Kayode Komolafe, a labor journalist, the lead editor of This Day, and a member of DACCOM, that's a Democratic Action Committee, and Emeka Ugu, a writer, editor, and researcher. We also have additional contribution if he is able to leave another Zoom meeting. That is from Chido Onoma, who is founder of Africa Center for Media and Information Literacy based in Abuja. Although he passed away in 2006, having spent his last years in Lagos, Curtis Joseph was very well known outside of the circles of leftist activists and movements in Nigeria. Current events across the world, and particularly in our country, where we are witnessing a renewed commitment to change by way of the EndSARS protests, spearheaded by the youth, make it imperative that we bring the work of foundational figures such as Curtis Joseph to common knowledge. As it happens, we first deliberated on this event in February of this year, which is by now a time so distant in memory in terms of what is possible for in-person events. We did not know then that we'll have to make do with a virtual event, although we imagined at the time that we involve some sort of technological mediation, given that potential participants were in different parts of the world. And we also didn't think that this topic will be sexy enough for a Nigerian billionaire to bankroll. So here we are. I have just two more remarks to add before yielding the floor to the first speaker. I wanted to say that Curtis Joseph was the first Nigerian to receive the Lenin Peace Prize in 1966, which was at the time an international prize that was the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Peace. Mrs. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti's award followed a few years later. African progressive intellectuals like him, Ransome-Kuti, and Baba Omojola were patronized by the Soviet Union and countries of the East Bloc in the shadow of the Communist Information Bureau, the supranational system that replaced Lenin-inspired Third International. The Bureau, better known as Cominform, was disbanded in the wake of de-Stalinization 10 years before Curtis Joseph won the Lenin Prize. It should be of interest to us what the attractions of this patronage system were for Nigerian and other African activists in the post-independence years, because Black political activists in metropolitan centers, figures like George Padmore, C.L.R. James, Claudia Jones, completely turned their backs on the Soviet system long before Cominform was established. For instance, Padmore actually rose so high in the Kremlin that he headed the Negro department. And at some point in the mid-30s, he had to disagree with them because, as it often happens with imperialists, Russia wanted to support England and America. And Padmore told them that, look, England, and then they wanted him to attack Germany and Japan. And he told them that Germany and Japan didn't have colonies in Africa. Why should I be attacking countries that didn't have colonies in Africa and supporting those like England and France that did have? And because he disagreed with them, he knew that they were going to get rid of him. He had to leave. So this happened in the 30s. So what I'm saying is, of course, that the fact that the same system, the same Soviet system was able to encourage figures like Curtis Joseph, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, and several other African radical intellectuals later in the 60s and down the years, it's actually something that we need to think about in terms of the real interest of these figures for the Soviet system. The other thing I wanted to say is to make an expression of gratitude, and that is to Dr. Edwin Madunagu, the radical historian and noted Marxist revolutionary. He gave sustained and unconditional support to this event, and he was kind enough to share a draft of his tribute to Curtis Joseph. I have his permission to quote some of it as his solidarity message, as we said in the informational material. Madunagu writes that in composing the tribute, and I quote him, "One of my inspirations is Nigeria Youth's Revolt of October 2020. It is an occasion to remember a largely self-educated rebel, well-read, well-traveled, undogmatic, and yet non-eclectic, a Marxist-Leninist who lived all his adult life for the revolution of the Nigerian peoples, but could not see even its beginnings. Remembering Comrade Curtis Joseph on the centenary of his birth should inspire us to reflect more deeply, more widely, and more creatively on the current problems of the Nigerian revolution that is now unambiguously on the agenda of history." End of quote. Another passage from that tribute is worth quoting because it can serve as a reminder to young activists in the EndSARS movement about the need for genuine solidarity and the challenges of commitment. He writes, and I quote, "In 1969, in Berlin, during the Nigerian Civil War, Curtis Joseph resigned his membership of the Presidential Committee rather than represent a factionalized Nigerian delegation. He had unsuccessfully tried to reconcile rival Nigerian and Biafran delegations. Members of the rival delegations were peacetime comrades in Nigeria. On this occasion, however, they chose to fight in the streets of Berlin." End of quote. I'll now call on our panelists, who will take turns in speaking for 15 minutes each. And then after that, I will try to moderate a discussion, a general discussion between ourselves and also between anyone who might tuning in. The first speaker is Mrs. Ladiola Yomi, former chairperson of the Radical Women in Nigeria and the editorial director and commissioning editor of Premium Times Books. She will speak on contemporaneous and subsequent events and trends in the decades after 1966, the year that Curtis Joseph was awarded the Lenin Peace Prize. So, Ladi.
Good morning, good afternoon, as the case may be. I hope you can hear me. First, please, I take an exception to describing women in Nigeria as radical and whatever. We were just a group of women activists doing our bit in those days. You know, I guess for now, looking back, you know, from this moment in time, it might seem radical for its day, but I don't think most of us want to wear that garb. Thank you very much. Okay. And thank you also for inviting me to this panel. I have to say that, like most of you, I learned about Curtis Joseph after he passed, and studied him quite a bit, you know, looking at the history of his historic win of the Lenin Peace Prize, and the circumstance under which he won it, and what was happening in the country at the time he won it. He got the prize in 1965. 1965, you know, of course, was one of the most turbulent years in Nigeria. It was the year of what in popular knowledge is known as the Wild Wild West years, you know, the wet years and all that. The years after the controversial election of 1964, after the controversial census of 1964, the election before it, and the even more controversial election of October 1965 in Western region, which many people say actually prepared the ground for the first coup of January 1966. You all perhaps remember that or have read, of course, like me and all, you know, that the years between, the months between the October 65 election and January 1966 coup, the country was literally ungovernable. You would have read about how impossible it was to journey from anywhere in central and northern Nigeria to Lagos, passing through the old Western region then was, to put it mildly, a big headache. It was under those conditions that Curtis Joseph won the Lenin Peace Prize. So you need to ask, what had he done, you know, to merit that? The Lenin Peace Prize, you know, puts him in very select group of people. Other winners, doing the research for this this forum, I discovered that other winners are some of the best known names, you know, in the world. You talk of so if you give me a second, I'll recall Nicholas Gillian. You talk of Paul Robeson, perhaps one of those who whose name will ring a bell more. Paul Robeson, the American, who I think a lot of you will know is of Nigerian descent. He won the prize like more than 10 years before Curtis Joseph. So it puts him in this kind of very celebrated group of people. And what is the work he had done to merit that is the question that, you know, I've tried to answer. And I have to say that we will never know. I personally don't know. I think it will take a lot of research to dig up, you know, all of what is done. But I'll give the brief synopsis I discovered. Now, the leftist Marxist movement, intellectual movement, how did this even get to Nigeria anyway? To the point where a self-educated, largely self-educated man like Curtis Joseph would be caught up in it to the point of winning the Lenin Peace Prize. It's important to, sorry, just give me a second. So sorry about the interruption. It's important to realize that the Marxist-Leninist movement, you know, actually came into Nigeria in the years between the two world wars. At the end of World War I, there was the American president, you know, sort of gave a lot of hope to the struggling countries of the world. And when he led the movement that called for self-determination of all nationals and called on Europe, you know, to do that kind of justice to their colonies and to everybody under their, you know, under their influence, so to say, to prevent that kind of event again. The reality, it was a call that many people heeded to, including, by the way, Nigerians of the time who, the Western educated Nigerians, most of whom were students in Europe and, well, for Nigerians, especially in London and Paris, you know, it was a call to which they really heeded. But when the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I was signed, it fell short very much on that promise. You know, it actually reaffirmed for the Europeans, it reaffirmed their colonial holdings, made peace with that. And perhaps the only change it brought was that they took from Germany its own colonial holdings and passed it on to I think the League of Nations, the mandate territories on that. That is, I'm sorry, those are the German colonies in Africa. You know, passed it on to the League of Nations and then ended up making the mandate territories under the United Nations when it came along. So no, it's the promise of freedom, the promise of self-determination, you know, fell through. Fast forward to the Second World War, it was more or less the same thing. At the end of the Second World War, you know, there was the Atlantic Charter and all that, which promised, you know, again, urged on paper, or rather in speeches, urged Europe to give up its colonies and give you know, give the people their right to self-determination. Again, when the rubber hit the road, when the actual agreements were signed and when the actual policies were made, you know, Africans who were eager for self-determination were left out in the cold, so to say. It was at that period that other influences started seeping into, if you like, what one can call the national consciousness. You'll recall that, I believe it was in 1947, you know, that, or before 1947, that the great Zik himself led a delegation to the UK, in which the memo they submitted to the colonial officers in London then, you know, demanded self-determination for Nigerians within 15 years based on the promise of the Atlantic Charter, which of course, you know, was not well received. It was under those circumstances that, if you like, the old Soviet Union, the progressive left, the Marxist-Leninist ideas started seeping into Nigeria. Now, it was never broad-based. You know, a lot of the folks of that time, you know, those who were better, who had better educational opportunities than Curtis Joseph, you know, got to learn a little bit of it. You know, in London, you recall that those were the days of the Nigeria Youth Movement, which inherited some of the mandate of the I think it was the West African Students Union back in the UK. So folks like that who had that opportunity, you know, got to became familiar with that ideas and the ideologies of the Marxist-Leninist movement and brought it back with them to Nigeria. Curtis Joseph did not have that. This is a young man who who literally had to start fending for himself from his teenage years. I think that is what makes his life remarkable, that even in this day when we have the internet and all this technology, it's pretty tough for a teenager, you know, to take control of his life, become his own sustainer in every way, even to the point of political ideology, and a progressive one at that. You know, it's pretty tough and rare to come by. That is what makes him remarkable, the fact that we first see the major political activity that is recorded in his life is in the 1940s, when in 1947, he, as an employee of what we now know as a multinational company, you know, joined the, or rather, worked with the NCNC when they came to town in, when they led a visit to the town where he worked, you know. And there was sort of no stopping him from then. A lot of his own development, he did himself, because the NCNC had some kind of youth wing, and but they did not have a curriculum, so to say, for, you know, developing the minds of even the young people of then who were who subscribed to their views and subscribed to their to their policies. You know, it really behoved on it. And for Curtis Joseph to have grown up through those years, you know, all on his own, imbibing the ideology of Marxism and progressive politics, you know, like I said, I don't think we ever know the full gist of it, but that is what makes him remarkable. By 1961, when he and a few other Nigerians, you know, launched the Nigerian People's Party, at that time, there were already concerted efforts against, well, don't forget those were in the, I won't call it the earliest days of the Cold War, but those were, well, for Nigeria, those were the earliest days of the Cold War. And there were already concerted efforts against that kind of ideology, you know, seeping into the country. There were already warnings, if you like, from the British who were going out then to the incoming chosen administration, you know, that to watch out for elements like Curtis Joseph and others. And, you know, there was Gogo Nzeribe, if you remember, you know, the great trade unionists of the time, and so many others, you know, to watch out for them, to make sure that their influence, you know, does not spread. I think I hope I'm rounding up my 15 minutes now, but to mention this, what was happening in Nigeria at that time was not peculiar to Nigeria. Indeed, around the British Empire, the defunct British Empire now, you know, a lot of youth movements, you know, that embraced the ideology of self-determination that the USSR represented at the time, and which the Marxism was all about. You know, there were many such movements around. The curious thing about what happened in Nigeria and what happened elsewhere was that there was never, whereas the administrations, the various administrations were warned by their British colonial overlords and friends to stem the growth of any such radical ideology. In other places, they actually mounted state resources, state repressive agenda against, you know, that kind of movement. That did not happen in Nigeria. It didn't happen in Nigeria. I mean, people were jailed, for instance, for participating in the 1945 strike. And I believe between 1945, for example, and 1965, there were like 300 strikes, labor union strikes, all of which were heavily influenced, by the way, after Curtis, for example, resigned from UAC where he was working and went into full leftist politics, including the one of 1965, which, as you all probably know, that then the great Zik himself was supposed to, you know. Now, in other jurisdictions, the state found it essential to actually mount very repressive regimen against this kind of, you know, the trade union activities, leftist thought and all that. But in Nigeria, they didn't do that, and they didn't have to. So you ask yourself why. And I cannot claim to have an answer to that. I'm just going to give you my own little thoughts on that. Number one is that the left was never well grounded in Nigeria, at least at that time. I'm not going to speak for now. But at that time, you know, there were lots of ideas, there were lots of enthusiasm, but there was no grounding, you know. And this is where Aki mentioned now what Comrade Madunagu, the tribute he paid for it. I think, again, part of what I've read was that Madunagu wrote elsewhere that Curtis Joseph in the 80s and towards the end of his life, talked a lot about betrayal and all that by a lot of the different people and groups he worked with. What was happening in Nigeria of the time was that there was a lot of people who fell into this category of leftist thinkers, if you like. They were simply people with, sorry to disappoint you, a lot of middle class aspirations. They were, you know, they were seeking, you know, for themselves, you know, a little bit more of the comforts and conveniences of life. The only thing that actually distinguishes them and distinguished them from other politicians was that they were not seeking it solely for themselves. Again, to quote Madunagu on this, a lot of these people belonged to a group. Oh no, I'm sorry, I will not say a lot of these people. Curtis Joseph, in this group, you know, belonged to the sub part of the group who they have nothing to fall back on. He didn't have parents. He didn't really have political connections, you know, because you burn your political connections in those days when you start spewing leftist ideology. So he didn't have political connection. He had no class comfort. He did not belong to the class of, you know, the traditional rulers then who were being rehabilitated, you know, into modern Nigeria. They had lost their political power. They still had a lot of clout, social class. He didn't belong to that class. So he actually belonged to, yes, he had his middle class aspirations, but he belonged to a group of people who, to use Madunagu's words here, can only liberate themselves by liberating everybody else. And that was the core of his politics. But he was surrounded by other middle class aspirants who had connections that they could dig into. And what made it worse, coming back to the reason why the state did not have to mount any kind of infrastructure, so to say, to destroy the left in Nigeria, was that the administrators and politicians and their British backers of that time recognized the fact that these guys were just, a lot of them were just middle class aspirants, and threw a lot of carrots their way. Those were the days where you had a lot of training, you know, being offered by the British Council, by, you know, this group, that group, you know, and all that. And once these opportunities were flung into the leftist movement, there was a scramble for it. And of course, again, those who are connected got the opportunities and forgot the struggle, so to say. Even, unfortunately, I mean, you mentioned, like, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the acronym, you called it BIACIN, but, you know, the Russian information service, so to say.
COMINFORM, the Communist Information Bureau.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even they offered training opportunities. And folks like me grew up knowing of Nigerians who benefited from those opportunities and promptly came back from Russia and then just forgot the struggle and, you know, set themselves on the road to self-enrichment. And that was the end of it for them. So what we had was a movement that was never grounded. It was so much on the periphery. It was never, you know, it was so much on the periphery that I think that it didn't even make it, it certainly didn't even make its way into the educational books that we all read growing up. How many of us knew, for instance, that there had been a Labour Party in Nigeria since the 1950s? You know, all those, you know, they sort of all just come in and fizzle out because there was no commitment to them, no education, nothing. And so the Curtis Josephs of this world, and this particular Curtis Joseph, is to be remembered for his commitment, for his, you know, for his dogged fight. But he fought alone. I think the major lesson from his life for those of us now, and yes, for the young people who have just, you know, awakened the world to Nigerian problems with the NSAS movement, the lesson they really need to learn is to see how easy it is to lose your mandate, how easy it is to lose, you know, whatever vision is, you know, goes into the struggle you are engaged in. It is not, there's nothing easier because, you know, all you need, if you are not sufficiently organized, if you are not sufficiently, if you do not root it to the aspirations of Nigerians who are outside your own little circle, you know, if you do not root it to the aspirations, quite frankly, of, I don't know, the peasants, as we usually say, you know, of people who are indeed the I don't know how else to put it, but people who are indeed, at the receiving, who have no, they don't have an inroad into the Nigeria apparatchik, so to say. If you do not talk to them, if they are not a part of your movement, all you really are is just, at the end of the day, you're just going to become a social club. Argue among yourselves and dissipate energy. I mean, I'm going to end this on the note that Aki introduced me by saying I'm a member of Women in Nigeria, of the Lagos branch. How many people know about Women in Nigeria today? When we were members of that, it was, we were the so-called radical women's movement, blah, blah, blah. But again, we made the same mistake. We were academics, we were journalists, we were, entrepreneurs, but we were not, we were not your run-of-the-mill woman who struggles to even get clean water, for to make life sustainable in her household every day. We never concerned ourselves, for example, with the struggles of a person like our mothers and grandmothers who just getting water to drink is takes out of every 24 hours, probably takes like 3 hours of their day, every single day. And so we just became, at the end of the day, a social club. And it was easy, for the likes of then Mary Babangida to make an incursion into Women in Nigeria, which she did, and many other folks like that. So that's the sort of lesson, that looking at the life of Curtis Joseph, imparts on us, and that is what the warning we need to put out for the coming generation. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This is really very insightful and quite inspiring. Really, the idea of talking to people who are now, so to speak, on the ground playing, to know that not only have things gone before, but that there are precious lessons to learn from how people did it and why they shouldn't repeat those errors if they want to actually get successful. I mean, it's always the question that comes up in situations like these, and we always quickly forget it as soon as we are taught. The reason I mentioned radical to win is that we always try to oppose it to NCIWS or NCWS, that's National Council of Women's Societies, which we thought were actually a bit more, not only very bourgeois, but also wanted to really manage groups, and often thought of WIN as always very unwilling to be incorporated as such. But of course, we know that there was hardly anything that Babangida and his ilk at that time did not try to manage or bribe or neutralize when they couldn't do either of those two things. So, but that was the context. And it's good to know that that's what the image, the idea was different on the other side. So I will call next on the second speaker, that's Dr. Said Husseini, who I think he's the only one who had the privilege of being on stage in Lagos. I can see him sitting. It's a privilege, but actually he also feels lonely out there. I don't know why they left him by himself, but I think but at least he's there. He's ready to talk. He's currently a postdoctoral fellow with the Project on Migration, Urbanization, and Conflict in Africa, that's in MICA at the University of Lagos. He completed his doctoral training in 2019, got a very excellent degree, Department of International Development at the University of Oxford. And his current research follows the development of political parties in Nigeria, especially party organization and ideology. The focus of his contribution today is on party politics and the wider political context that nurtured Curtis Joseph's ideological evolution. So over to you, Said.
The introduction, thank you all for being here. I guess everyone can hear me okay? Fine. So I try to listen to all of the interests that are not in the room. I think we're going to so, like I said, the vision is based on some work I do on research I've done for my doctoral work.
Just a moment. Can they move the mic or the computer close to him? I mean, we can hear him, but it basically sounded like far back. Is there anything people can do? I mean, keep going. If they can help with the technology, that's what I'm just saying.
Or you might just want to put it close to the all right. It's on you. Okay, can you hear us now? Okay, how about now? Okay, great. Looks like the timing. So maybe I should my presentation now while I was some external skills. Okay, so we don't mind let's say here, and step back a bit about for what we're discussing today. Not only the legacy of Joseph was kind of environment that produced thinkers and figures like Joseph. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of ideological values that kind of define the context. Like Joseph, you just said a little bit about. So I really did it. The anti-colonial nationalist period, which gave rise to this Marxism, is often seen as an ideological flourishing in Nigeria. Between the 30s and 50s.
these movements were internationalist at the onset. And I think that's important to highlight in the midst of generation of Nigerians or nationalists. We're not only looking for a unified Nigeria, we're looking for much more than international standards of actually discuss. But just to say a little bit more about that period, one of the first organizations that captured a lot of these kind of internationalists, left-leaning nationalists, when they were arriving back in Nigeria, when they were connecting with sort of existing Nigerian radicals, was the Nigerian youth movement, which a lot of us maybe would have heard about. And NYN became a kind of organizational home for people like Rawa and it was founded in 1934. And it was initially demanding for improvements in higher education, but soon became a pan-Nigerian political party. So the NYM, in my view, was, some would argue, the first truly nationalist party. Because it was nationalist not only in rhetoric and demanding for increased Nigerian representation in colonial institutions, but it was nationalist in its character, right? It had branches and membership all across the country. And it's very reminiscent in the sense of what we're seeing now with NSAS agitations. A group of young people who are organized not only in Lagos, which at the time was the colonial capital, but across the country. So the NYM challenged and defeated the NNDP, right, in 1938. So again, you can see a direct confrontation within the anti-colonial movement about what the future would look like. Sometimes we think about nationalism as some sort of unified movement in Nigeria where they all had this opposition to colonialism, but they also had very different approaches for how they wanted to articulate their opposition to colonial state and the kind of future that they thought Nigeria should be. However, following a split in the NYM in 1941, CPWA and some of his followers formed the National Council for Nigeria and Cameroon, the NCNC. Which came to widespread prominence in support for general strike in 1945, which the previous presenter spoke about. And though not a political party, the NCNC became a home to many anti-colonial organizations across the country. And you will hear a little more in the next presentation, I believe, about Joseph's specific role in the NCNC. The chief of all the organizations that were absorbed into the NCNC when formed was the Sikhism movement. And I'll talk a little bit about the Sikhism movement now because I think it illustrates very well some of the ideological contestation that defined that time period. And I think it helps us understand a little bit where people like Joseph came from. So the Sikhism movement was arguably the most ideologically far-reaching organization of the entire nationalist period. So a new crop of left egalitarian political organizations blossomed in the ideological momentum sort of period between the two wars. And this gave rise to various groups, including
the Marxist group called the Talakawa Party. There was a Nigerian National Socialist Party. There was a Labour Party, which we just heard about in the previous presentation. These were formed in around 1945. But it was the radical Zikist movement formed within the NCSC in 46, which I think had the most profound influence on the nationalist movement. Zikists were inspired by Zikiwe, as you can tell in their name, but they differed organizationally and ideologically from Zikiwe and the NCSC. They were broadly socialist in orientation, and they drew inspiration from black nationalism, from the success of independence movements in India and Pakistan at that time, and also they saw the waning commitment of the NCNC to the independence struggle as an inspiration for taking matters into their own hands. It was very much a kind of generational realization that the leadership of the nationalist movement seemed to be waning in their enthusiasm and kind of creativity in pushing forward the struggle. So that's why the Zikist movement emerged within the NCNC. And so, one kind of illustrative example of the Zikist movement's reach and their ambition was in the Enugu massacre of 1949. So just to read a little bit about what that was like. General Secretary of the Colliers Union, Ukodili Isaiah Ochi, a Zikist, was among the leaders of the strike in Enugu, whose violent suppression in 1949, the massacre of 21 Nigerian miners, galvanized anti-colonial fervors across the country. And in fact, its General Commission of Inquiry, which was called to investigate the incident, held the Zikist movement responsible for the arrest which broke out after the miners' strike was violently suppressed. And this inadvertently reinforced the movement's national prominence and contributed to discrediting British rule in Nigeria. Indeed, some say that it was a kind of wider period of unrest brought about by the Zikists' efforts that led to colonial states' adoption of a new constitution, the Manifesto Constitution in 1951, which took the country a step closer to independence. And the left wing, let's say, of the anti-colonial movement further expanded in 1949 with the founding of the Northern Alliance Progressive Union, which was a political party led by Democratic Socialists, ex-teacher Aminu Kano, founded in Northern Nigeria. And then who crafted what's from a contemporary perspective might be thought of as a left populist appeal, urging for Talakawa, or the kind of commoners, to resist the Sarata, which is a household word for the traditional aristocracy, in its alliance with the colonial states, including the Red Group. I think that's an important point to highlight, just to point out that these ideological struggles that I'm describing, that were described in the previous presentation, that led to the emergence of figures like Prince Joseph, these struggles were not limited to southern Nigeria alone. So I think this kind of concept that northern Nigeria was somehow politically subservient to colonial states, to aristocratic leaders without any resistance, it doesn't do that history justice, because there was in fact strong both anti-colonial and anti-elitist left nationalism that emerged in the nationalist movement in the north. So what I've done here is to kind of spell out a little bit how the early first couple of generations of the nationalist movement were informed by sort of left-leaning global ideologies that became quite prominent in the interwar period. But that's not the Nigerian nationalist history that most of us are aware of. I think a lot of what we've been taught in school, a lot of what we think about when we think of the period of Nigerian nationalism, is what came after this. And what emerged after this kind of period of quite radical format was a period that I think about in a sense as a conservative backlash within the nationalist movement. And I won't go too deep into the question of how this emerged. A lot of it was kind of encouraged by this new constitution that was put in place in the 1950s. Actually, the constitution that was put in place after the Enugu massacre that I just talked about was squashed. That constitution both let in new parties and expanded the Nigerian Legislative Council based in Lagos, letting in kind of northern representation. But it also created houses of chiefs. It also kind of integrated a lot of the pre-existing, quite patriarchal, traditional kind of ethno-nationalist organizations into political parties and into the nationalist movement. So here we see the infiltration of different kinds of ideas, not only these kinds of emancipatory left ideas of how you organize the post-colonial state and how you push for nationalism, but also quite narrow, very often ethnic or regionalist ideas for how the future Nigeria should have been structured. And I mean, in the interest of allowing a bit of time for discussion, maybe I'll skip a bit forward. But this partially helps account for why, when independence came, people like Curtis Joseph were slightly caught outside of the mainstream parties and had to try to construct a slightly smaller parties such as the NPP, in order to find room for their own ideological perspectives to be represented. Why? Is because ultimately the parties that gained power both within the national struggle and took power from the British at independence were not these very ideologically far-reaching movements that started out, that were the initial vanguard of anti-colonial struggle. Rather, they were these movements that were kind of headed by charismatic ethno-regional figures such as Ahmad Bello or Azikiwe representing the East, or Awolowo representing the South, right? So this you can already see a constriction, in a sense, of the ideological ambitions and of kind of wide perspectives on how you order society that had started out in anti-colonial. And again, I think to kind of re-emphasize that point, and by way of trying to conclude, this helps us understand why we were seeing earlier on in the nationalist movement figures like Curtis Joseph take up quite central roles. We were seeing quite ideas that informed Joseph's own struggle, like Marxism, international socialism, have a very prominent place in the early independence movement. But by the end, by the point in time when the colonial state was handing over power, the generation or the kind of leadership that took over was one with much more constricted, much more ethnic or regional perspectives on what the good society looked like. So I think this wider kind of trajectory of large world-making aspirations in Nigerian and African sort of political ideologies, this sort of construction of those ideologies over time that we see just within the anti-colonial period has also continued since then, right? So I think this kind of background gives us a bit of an understanding of how the nationalist movement ended up being dominated by the people we think of as our founding fathers today, but also how the period that has followed that has continued to reveal
All right. Well, I can see, though I can't hear you. I mean, I can see that you stopped speaking. I am assuming. I don't know. I don't want to cut you off because audio in the last minute and a half just got off. So I don't know. Are you still speaking? Hello? Are you done? All right, can you hear me? What's going on?
No, it's still on here. It's just not projected.
All right.
So any questions?
Hello? Is Ibrahim, I'm sorry, is Said done speaking? Well, we intend to have questions after everyone has spoken. That's the way we have it set up. And so what I'll do now is call on the next speaker. That's Kayode Komolafe. I can see him here, and I wanted to just be sure that he can hear us. I saw him send a couple of texts about the audio quality earlier. So, KK, are you there? Okay, so you're going next. I was actually trying to be able to introduce you properly. I did mention you generally earlier, but I wanted to be able to.
I can go straight to business.
I'm okay, all right.
Comrade KK, that is okay.
Yes. Okay, Comrade KK, the ground is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'd like to salute the efforts of those who have put together this great honor in the memory of my constitution. Significance, and I also believe that those who have put efforts to make this possible, they have done a service to history. Since this session is coming up in the book festival, I think the first thing to say is that Constitution was perhaps one of the greatest bibliophiles in Nigeria. He had perhaps one of the largest private library that you could imagine. And as his way, because his natural inheritors, perhaps are not interested in his huge library. He had to will the library to his ideological heir, and that is Magnago. So all his documents, all his papers, books, which would be a very rich source for those who are interested in actually doing proper research of the history of the left. Go to all those that have been shipped to Calabar, to join Magnago's own monumental library there. I think it is important that the contemporary should be more charitable to the past, especially on occasions like this. It is not correct to say that the first generation of Nigerian left were just a middle class people who are not grounded. These were solidly ideological elements. Some of them were committed intellectuals, some of them were working class activists. But they are to borrow the Funmilayo phrase. There was a generation that actually discovered this mission, and never betrayed it. And I think it is important to enter into a preliminary defense of this. It is not also correct to say that the British colonial left in Anglos, how could have been, who was also a fellow laureate to Constitution in winning the Lenin Peace Prize, was prevented from traveling to Moscow. To Beijing. And our passport was seized by the Balawa government. So Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti had to go to Ghana to get a new passport from the government of Kwame Nkrumah, before she could make her travel. Such was the level of persecution of the British colonialists in the government. They felt that one of the things that the DO, the district officers in the colonial days, one of the charges they would, in their reports against the person was to call him a communist. And of course, how would the British government be lenient, the British colonial be lenient on Nigerian communists when even at home, the same government was very hostile to the British Labour Party, which was formed in 1920. Aralaski, the famous political scientist and economist of the London School of Economics, who incidentally was a teacher of Samuel Ekuku, the contemporary of Protégés Joseph. He even suffered persecution, relating, to having a relationship with Moscow. He was accused of, being a Stalinist, and that even affected his work and London School of Economics. So what I'm saying is that the British colonial government was actually anti-communist and was consciously so. And those cadres who were the first generation, perhaps they are organizationally, perhaps they imagine from early 1950s, actually suffered a lot, in the course of the struggle, and they suffered under very severe dictatorship. I remember another contemporary of Joseph, Dr. Tuju once told me a story. That was just telling that, oh, my generation was lucky, we could argue with him about Marxism because we had access to literature. As at that time, in the 80s, through this publishing house of the Soviet Union, Progress Publishers, you could acquire all the complete works of Lenin, complete works of Marx, and Engels, have access to all those literature. So, but still talking of the context, because it's important to situate the context, that in the 50s, that for them to do the research into some philosophical category of the left or whatever, that the most available source they could have was the Encyclopedia Britannica. That they had no access to literature, because even when they tried to order for it, communists in the Soviet Union or maybe in Europe, the colonial government will seize it and will prevent the cadres from having access to those literature. In fact, according to Otepe, he said when S.G. Kuku arrived in Nigeria in 1950 or so with his masters from the London School of Economics, that each had a cell group meeting, they developed 2 sessions. They always told Kuku that since you had the benefit of being in London School of Economics and also studied under Araloski, that once we have you on seat, we believe that we have our own Marx and Engels on seat. So that was the context in which Joseph emerged. And perhaps the most profound lesson that the present generation will have, lesson that they will have, about, they will learn from that particular generation, is that at a young age, they were able to sense the importance, the historical importance of being ideologically grounded. That's what I'm saying, that to be wrong to say that they were not ideologically grounded. And that is perhaps what is lacking in the contemporary time, because we delude ourselves philosophically, thinking that we live in a post-ideological age. Which in itself is a very toxic ideology of neoliberalism. So the contemporary, just like the end article could say, from their, this is so, they have no leaders, they have no program, they have no all this. But the truth of it is that to change society, to advance human progress, all this it has to be rooted in ideas. Thinking of for everybody to imagine that you will have a post-ideological world. It's just an optical illusion. Because what we're having is that the world today is still governed by ideology. While in the times of Joseph, when he got this honor, you see that that generation, I like the video intro, in class, that, comparing the Lenin Prize for Peace, comparing with the Nobel Prize for Peace. And I think that to me is, actually keeping fidelity to it. I mean, that was the moment, that was the situation in those days. And it was because of the orientation of generation, or conscious of the importance of ideology that people have been, the story which has been told very well, my other discussants, that it will rise to the point that even the highest level, of the government in Soviet Union that will consider him worthy, of that particular one, which in retrospect, and that we are now celebrating. And it was because of that political branding. That was a beginning of having fractious organization of being personalized and correct. But that generation of Dr. Joseph, they had on the politics of this country in the anti-colonial struggle. Most of the people today that generally you identify are just members of the civil movement. Some of them were Marxists, but as a time, the agenda was, it was the anti-colonial struggle. But in their consciousness, they could well see beyond that. And in the immediate post-independence era, that generation too, and these are some of the issues that Madam had dealt with brilliantly, in his tribute to Dr. Joseph. That generation which included SG, Kuku, Escotoyo, Tapofatu, Wahab Block, Kolagodi, and the rest of them, who has been mentioned there now. Now, that generation, they also had the sense of ideological organization, and Dr. Joseph was also part of this. In fact, the most feasible demonstration, of that generation of Dr. Joseph, the most feasible demonstration of this came during the Civil War. During the Civil War, you remember that at the point the Gabon regime had to seek, not minding, the cold war that where we will not smile at any African country, patronize it with had to seek the help, the military help of Soviet Union. The link between the Gabon regime and Soviet Union were members of the Nigerian left. In that particular point. Then on the other side, on the Biafran side, as soon as he recorded in his farewell book, to his readers, there was once a country. If you read the Ayara Declaration, in terms of content, you will see the contribution of the left, ideologically, the ideological content of Ayara Declaration. It wasn't the work of petty bourgeois and liberal elements. You see the contribution, the input, the leftist input, and of course, how would that not be when you people like Iken and Zimero, and others, being involved in it. So that was the generation which we are talking about. So if you ask me, I feel in retrospect, I feel very jealous and humbled, by the stature, of that particular generation in terms of their ideological comprehension of their moment in history, and also, their power of organization, in trying to execute it. Now, it did not even just stop there. I'm happy, like you mentioned, this great commander, Mojola. Mojola is a scholar, an economist, in his own right, made himself like a private secretary to the legendary leader, Imodo. So when you are talking of the issue of the 1945 strike, if you are talking of the issue of the 1964, the Jack, strike, just before the military intervention and subsequent Civil War, you discover that from the background, these cadres were the people involved. That is not to exonerate them, of their own organizational limitation, in the sense that
Well, I can see audio mute against Comrade KK's image, so I don't know whether that meant that he was done speaking, because at some point I couldn't hear him again too. Are you on? KK?
Hear me? I'm on.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
You're, okay. Yeah. Are you still speaking?
Yeah. I'm not around. Yeah.
Oh. All right. So.
Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes. So I was saying that what can we gain, from this commemoration, that we are having? I'm saying that there is a lot that, looking back, that we will find that very inspiring, from the generation of protégés, the contemporary. And I'm saying that one element that we can isolate, that we can distill from that, is that for any generation that wants to change, that wants to advance human progress, that there is need for clarity. And the basis of that clarity is basically ideological grounding. So this hypocrisy, of saying that, we are beyond the ideology, ideology does not matter. When actually we are doing that in service of another ideology, it will not. So the thing is to consciously make the ideological choice, let it inform the practice, And I think in that regard, we will be able to push the frontier of human freedom and progress better. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. This ended on a very powerful and compelling note. And so we'll have questions for you and for other speakers. And we'll go to our final speaker, and that's Emeka Ugu, who has been trying to do for our own general sketching of the Curtis Joseph, and he's at work on that. He is a data analyst and also co-founder of Wawa Book Review, as well as a researcher in his own right. And so his contribution is actually based on what he's been trying to do, chasing down fairly comprehensive, or at least integral knowledge of Curtis Joseph. So Emeka,
Hello. Hello. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Where do I start? Okay. So let me start by saying that I first found out about Curtis Joseph from Professor Adeshoko, and just hearing that he had won, the Lenin Peace Prize piqued my interest, and then I sought to find out more about him. But I think the striking thing, initially when I started to follow how do I say now? I started to ask questions of who he was that I found that there was very little that you could find about the man online, you know, bar say a picture or a Wikipedia entry that said that he had won the Lenin Peace Prize, and that was it really. But through, you know, his own help and the help of Comrade KK, I got in touch with Edwin Madnagu, who I had met a few years before then. And then we got talking, and, you know, that way I started to bring pieces of the life of Curtis Joseph together. And this also led me to his daughter, physically or, you know, virtually. Yeah, and then some of his acquaintances, people who actually did meet him while, you know, he lived. I don't know where to start, but I think that everyone kind of knows that, okay, this is his centenary. If he was alive, he would have been 100 years old 2 days ago on the 8th of November. And he left us in 2006, I think it was, sometime in December, yeah. Curtis Joseph was born in 1920 to parents from the Benin part of Nigeria, you know, Old Bendel State. And then 2 years before he was born, his parents had moved to Ikare. Anyone who knows that in Ondo, certain parts of Ondo and Edo, you know, share a boundary. So, you know, that migration wouldn't have been far-fetched. But yes, and so it was because he was born there that he got the name Ayodele. Joseph is his father's Christian name, say baptismal name, which he appended to Curtis, so that no one would know where he was from, you know, in terms of being Nigerian. Because he was, you know, just reading about him, you'd learn quickly that he was a very detribalized Nigerian who started out life at the age of 15 after having studied at a missionary school under a Reverend Father called Lennon, I think it was. Yeah. So one of the greatest joys of his life was that he had finished reading or studying the Bible at the age of 15. And I'm just giving you an idea what kind of mind that we're talking about here. And then he started working as a shop assistant, and not too long after that, he got employed into the service of the UAC. Slowly, but gradually, he rose to what you would call mid-level management, or even top-level management, because he handled a full station in Okitipupa in the 40s. I mean, I'm talking about the mid-40s now. And it was at that time that he kind of piloted the NCNC movement. I mean, so the NCNC at the time were going on a tour. They had issues, you know, people like Zeke, the older Macaulay now, who died during that period as well, had issues with the 1946 Richardson Constitution, and, you know, in airing their grievances and in order to sensitize, you know, the Nigerian masses, they had gone around different. And so on this occasion, you know, by putting his money where his mouth was, and then by, you know, actually doing the organizational work required, Curtis Joseph was able to pilot, you know, that entourage of people led first by the older Macaulay, but secondly, when he passed on, by Nnamdi Azikiwe into Okitipupa. And Okitipupa was a big town in those days. It wasn't your run-of-the-mill town. It wasn't a village either, you know, from what I gather. So yes, and afterwards because, you know, in his younger days, because he couldn't go to school, you know, because the means wasn't there anyway for him to, you know, go beyond primary school education. He enrolled for correspondence courses, you know, I think in the UK, you know, for journalism, business, commerce, philosophy, and politics. And it would be fair to say that he used all of all that the knowledge that he gathered in all walks of life, whether the politics, the business, and all that. So we're talking about somebody who wasn't just content with staying down or being where he was placed by virtue of his circumstances of his birth. He was somebody who wanted to get things done, and he found ways to get them done irrespective. So so Curtis Joseph in 46, after the Okitipupa event with the NCNC, wrote about that event, and that got him into a lot of trouble with his employers at UAC, and that started the beginning of a really not so nice relationship with the UAC. He would leave the UAC finally in 1951, and he wanted, the idea at the time was to set up a big conglomerate, that could really muscle the UAC for power, something that was entirely Nigerian, because I think that he had figured out, maybe not totally, but he had a hunch in 1951 that something was going wrong. And part of what he thought was going wrong is something that Bade Onimode in his book Imperialism and Underdevelopment in Nigeria has fingered, this issue of how during the first phase of decolonization, the UAC had politicized its business role in Nigeria and had started to lobby not just the colonial office back in Britain, but the colonial government, as well as a certain class of Nigerian, politicians. And it wasn't so smooth, I mean, if you look at the history of it, there was friction in between. So there were times when the colonial office in England didn't even agree with the colonial government, who both didn't agree with, some of our own bourgeois elites in NCNC, in the AG, and in the MPC at the time. But somehow they managed to get, a consensus, which meant that the UAC had found a way to get at least 2 or 3 representatives within the legislative houses, both in central Lagos and within the regions all around. And these representatives were there to protect their business interests. And what were their business interests at the time? Business interests were basically to ensure that they could always move, raw materials from, Nigeria and other colonies to get refined in the West, and then at prices that they fixed. And then once they, because they were the most industrialized country in the world at the time, once they had turned this into manufactured goods, they then sent them back, to Nigeria. And that's how the story of Nigeria began, with its balance of payments. To a large extent, Curtis Joseph, by virtue of the fact that he had worked for these people, knew that there was something wrong with that system. Whether he had the education to express it as such is a totally different thing, but he already had a hunch that this was what was going on. And so he sought to build alliances with different or like minds to see if they could build something that could actually fight the hold that UAC had of the Nigerian economy. That didn't amount to much. So not too long after that, he decided to go it on his own. So that's one part of Curtis Joseph's life that I think is important that we bear in mind. The second bit had to do with his membership also in 1951 of an organization called the World Congress of Peace. The World Congress of Peace, depending on who you ask, is many things to different people. If you ask the Russians or the people from the Soviet Union at the time, they would tell you in the world, because don't forget, this organization was formed in 1949. as a response to the creation of NATO by the Americans, and so and this was just after the Second World War. So this organization was one organization that Curtis Joseph was became a member of. I mean, the first Nigerian member of that organization in 1951, and what he did with that organization over over a decade, or maybe close to 2 decades, is phenomenal work, from discussing the atomic bombs in scenarios in Hiroshima in the 60s, and all sorts of peace treaties that he did it, and he couldn't attend those. He always sent in letters because he couldn't. The situation in Nigeria at the time was such that because he was already being tagged the communist, he couldn't even travel. So he didn't even travel he didn't attend their first conference until 1961, 62, I think that was. And yeah, so that's one aspect of, that's another aspect of his life that I'd like for us to bear in mind. The third one has to do with what he was able to achieve as in the short time that the Nigerian People's Party existed, and why it was that he even came to that decision. So I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that a lot of what Curtis Joseph did needs to be looked at through the lens of his work with the UAC, what it was able to teach him, how it made him understand Nigeria perhaps a little better, and then how his work within the World Congress of Peace, which basically, if you ask the Americans, I mean, there's a declassified document, I think this was declassified in 2015, where the CIA claims that the World Congress of Peace at the time was a front by the Soviet Union. In those days, it was housed under the Comintern, and they saw to its running. But essentially, the CIA agrees that of all Soviet fronts at the time, and then there were quite a number of them, that particular one was the major one. So if you talk about left, the left in Nigeria and its alliances with international leftist organizations, then it's clear to see how Curtis Joseph himself was perhaps the biggest champion of that cause. If, for instance, an organization that he became a member of the Presidential Committee in 1965 was claimed by the powerful CIA of America to be one of, actually to be the main front of the Soviet not overt now, soft operations, in terms of winning minds, and that's why they could win minds from the intelligentsia, the writerly society, from the civil societies, from trade unions and all of that. So I think that's what bearing in mind, that also what he was able to do in that regard. At some point when he couldn't actualize some of his dreams, what he then proceeded to do was set up his own trading and import and export company. And in doing that, what he did was that he built a big factory somewhere in the Akuonjo part of Lagos. That still, well, the factory is not operational anymore, but it's still, you can see the remains there. And part of what they did was that they bought bones and then they crushed it and then they shipped them, exported them, because one of the byproducts for crushed bones was is tiled, as some of us know. So I'm just trying to paint a general picture of the kind of, and that if he wanted to be just a man of means, without recourse to what the next person on the street or someone more less privileged than he was, he could have been an Awolowo too. He could have been anybody. He could have been Ojukwu's father, who we hear that was the richest man at some point. Because he also came from that mercantilist class of Nigerians. But I think that it's also important to mention here that his own trajectory towards the left is a bit different from some of his own contemporaries, because I hear KK mentioned maybe not Mukogo Okoye or Rabji Abdullah or some of these other guys who were essentially Zikists, who were Zikists by 1946. He wasn't a Zikist in 1946, and he was never a Zikist, to be honest. In fact, some of the things that I struggled with, the more I found out about him, was if he was working for UAC in 1946, 47, 48, 49, 50, where was he during the massacre of miners in Udi or in Enugu there at the time? Where was he when Nduka is led, 16,000 Junamag UAC workers on a planned strike for cost of living allowance? So I think that at some point it's safe to say that he was a non-joiner, but over time, through his own experiences and his own analysis, because he was part of what he did when he left the employ of UAC was that he was asked to go and run in Benin for elective post, but he declined. He declined, saying that he would rather, open a small trading business and write, without any pay, just for him to maintain his independence of mind. So it was something that he guarded jealous. This was what I was going to do for myself. He basically gradually then began to move to the left. It first started with his, coming into contact with leftist literature, establishing contacts with, leftist publishers based in the UK. So he did also open a bookshop, So I also hear KK say how difficult it was at that time to get leftist literature. So if you needed leftist literature in Nigeria in the 50s, in the early 50s, mid 50s, late 50s, this was the man to go to. And he got into a lot of problem because of this. The colonial police force at the time there were many times when they raided his house and his bookshop, his offices, because he was actually dealing in Marxist social Leninist literature, essentially. Anybody who knows a bit of history also knows that part of the reason why some of the Zikists were arrested, there's someone like Mukogo Okoye, for instance, was arrested just after, I think, the Iva Valley protests, was that he was found with leftist literature, at the time. So it was a very trying period for him. But then, of course, it's almost impossible to talk about Curtis Joseph and not talk about his role, his own public intervention during the Biafran War. I think that's where he rose to his full intellectual height during that period, because it was very bold of someone who hadn't really gotten any real formal education to exhibit the kind of ideological clarity that he exhibited there, which was simply that in 1969, I think it was, he led a delegation of both Biafrans and Nigerians to the Berlin World Congress of Peace, World Peace Congress in Berlin. I think that was 1969, if I'm not mistaken. And the fight broke out, and he not only resigned. He not only say he couldn't lead a broken house. He resigned his position as on the presidential panel of the organization there and then, because as he said, he couldn't lead. He thought that the left should have offered a third position, of the sort that Wale Soyinka offered, during the war. And as far as that wasn't possible, he didn't see any reason why he should have led, a factional house, and that was it for him. And I find that find that interesting because I'm, from the eastern part of Nigeria, and as they say, it's almost, even though I didn't witness the war, I have heard stories about the war. In fact, I have uncles who still have bullet wounds till tomorrow, and who talk about wars in terms of sectors, and even when they are making jest of each other, trying to say that, or one person was not in the thick of it, and in fact that one person, he didn't really see the war. So I found that, for some people, there were people who did have the ideological clarity to know that it couldn't be one of either, that there was a way to stand aside from this and take a more tempered look at the whole situation, So so that for me is what I think that I find very intriguing about his press. And this is important because if you listen well to Bade Onimode, who makes the case very strongly, and he makes this case as far back as 1984. In fact, I don't think anybody's saying anything new now, and even though the world has changed in certain ways, but I think that what he said in 1984 is still very strong. And it brings me back to, I think I caught a bit of what Said was saying earlier on, trying to paint the landscape of, and this is something that I'd want to say from the depth of my heart, whether it's perceived as right or wrong, whether it ruffles anybody's feathers. But I'm reading and discovering, people like Nduka Eze, Mukubu Okoye, Okoye, Ikenan Zimiru, Raja Abdullah, these guys who spent time in jail because they actually did the work of fighting the colonial government as Zikists and leftists, even Ogidegbe, Macaulay, people of this ilk. I wonder why history has been so unkind to them. And then when the history of Nigeria is told, and in terms of the struggle for independence, we keep hearing about founding fathers. Whereas when you go and you look really closely under the hood of all of that narrative that is being pushed, you discover that these people actually sold out. But basically what they did was that they were specially bred by the British colonial government to take over power. And why they were asked to take over power was to maintain a certain system. This system where we have essentially big corporations pulling the purse strings of this nation. And then you find that when push comes to shove, when you start to dig under the hood, you find that it's usually tied to one individual or the other. So it's this whole system that I think that needs to be addressed. And when we tell the history of the struggle for independence, it's imperative that these guys get their place. Of course, that's to say that a lot of this has to do with a bit of criticism, not even a bit, a large criticism towards the Nigerian left, which I think personally has managed not to tell its own stories the way it should be told, and which is why people would think, for instance, that it doesn't exist, or that because of the skirmishes that it's always had, it's disintegrated to the point where it's not a force to reckon with. I think it's a force to reckon with, but that they need to do a lot more work in terms of putting out the message out there of what it is that they have done for this country. Because politically, it's the oldest tendency. I mean, it was there way before any of all these other tendencies came. So it's always a thing of worry to me that I don't get why the oldest tendency in Nigeria hasn't even produced, okay, apart from the guys in Kano and Kaduna, PRP, I don't see why they haven't even produced the national leader. But I mean that this is just me talking. What I find is that Curtis Joseph's life as an entrepreneur who rose to, the height of it, because I was shocked that sometime in the late 60s, early 70s, he already acquired somewhere in the Akowojo area of Lagos, which was essentially a thick bush at the time, acres of land to build a factory. So I can imagine what his vision was at the time, And this was somebody who was friends with Kwame Nkrumah, he won the Lenin Peace Prize before even the Mandela did. I think there were only two Africans who had won the prize before him, Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré. So this is, somebody who who kept on assisting, people who dared to have a different mindset from, what the norm was. And it's sad that, I'm closer to 40 than I am 30, and I'm only just discovering about him. And it wouldn't be because I wasn't really very good at reading my own history, because I'm not one of those people who give the excuse that it wasn't taught in school. So yeah, so I think I'll leave it there for now. I don't know if I have exceeded. Yeah.
Yes, you have. It's all right. I mean, it is a very fascinating moment, and it's quite interesting. Thank you, everyone. There's always this very complex, let's say, sensitive balance between really telling things as they are and really bringing to the to light is stories, as you were saying towards the end of your presentation, that have been systematically ignored or neglected or actually suppressed. And so there's that, but there's also this tendency on our part to also overspend, to take too much time. So, it's always of interest to me that as with people who actually are trying to not necessarily govern, but to actually change the world, right? There are certain elements, there are certain skills that we also need to develop, which is actually to keep to time. I remember in 1956 when the so-called Paris conference was held at the Sorbonne, and with Senghor, Aimé Césaire, all those big black power men, intellectuals. I mean, it was interesting that those who had a lot to say, people like Aimé Césaire, like Cheikh Anta Diop, actually spent too much time. And somebody who recorded it, that was James Baldwin, he said it was really, kind of put off by that. So, I mean, so what I'm trying to say is that, in terms of really producing material that people actually can relate to, that it's also good for us to be actually, to be sensitive to the need to do things, to really work within frame, to keep to time, because it's actually very important. I mean, it's interesting now. When I came here about 2-3 hours ago, I saw maybe over 50 people log in to the other event, but now we are just speaking to ourselves. So there's always these issues, but we are saying them. And so I wanted to say thank you to all the panelists. It's a lot of effort to actually prepare for this, to dedicate time to it, and to actually produce something that's very systematic and very inspiring. So for me, personally, I wanted to say that, irrespective of what may sound like some kind of criticism about how much time people took, I thought I'll add that too. So thank you very much. And I did send a chat message to the LABAF person. I was hoping that whoever was there, I can see a man with the Gatsby hat. I don't know whether he's the one doing that. And I was hoping that he or she would be able to coordinate this, like send me some questions that I cannot find, but I didn't see that. So what I want to do for those listening and for our panelists is to try to give a general summary of what has been said, and maybe just pose a question in hoping that they will be able to respond to this, while attendees, those who are listening in, can also ask their own questions, or we can have this discussion, because I'm actually interested in us talking to ourselves, because there have been a few, not necessarily contradictory, but contentious statements, and how those who are actually who are basically listening in can make a contribution to that. So what I've heard so far is this question of the relationship between the nature of left politics in Nigeria at the time that Curtis Joseph was coming up, the historical context, both in terms of the history of Nigeria, especially history of political organization in Nigeria, and how leftist or progressive elements like himself, Gogo, Chu Nzeribe, and all those people that we all know, Kolabodi and others, how they played into this. And so that's one thing, and why there was the possibility of a leftist party like the NPP, which actually the NPP that we often talk about was the one that Zik formed in 1979. I mean, people often forget that there was that party that was, in a sense, an outgrowth of the Zikist movement, and it was really exclusively developed and controlled by progressive elements like himself. And so there's that, but also, and I'm trying to approach this in a more conceptual way. This is really trying to bring together what I heard from Said Husseini and Comrade KK, and also to some extent towards the end, or maybe even right in the middle of your presentation, Emeka. This is a question of how to actually think in terms of the relationship between nationalism, that it is really quite interesting that the tension that often developed between the so-called bourgeois elements and the progressive politics, actually that tension often not necessarily sort of oscillates between the question of nationalism and class. The idea, what I'm trying to suggest, is the fact that, you know, they all belong, so to speak, to the Nigerian nation that at that time was still sort of largely a colonized country, or was on the cusp of political independence. And there was also, of course, the question of class that was posed by Ladi, which is the idea that, look, you could be the vanguard, you could be people with political instinct and extremely powerful ideological passion, and not be connected with the people. So, and that's really essentially a question of class. And I mean, one thing that often comes to me when I think about this is to think of a place like Abeokuta as, you know, if you want, you know, I mean, if you look back to a book like Ake by Wole Soyinka, for instance, you find this tension between everybody being an Egba person, and the fact that even between that, within that nationalism, that microcosmic nation of Abeokuta or Egba, there were these important issues about who is really in charge. You know, I mean, does an Egba person feel a stronger pull towards being an Egba person, or towards the question of how limited his or her circumstances were? And so I think that this question can actually also be posed at the level of the kind of discussion we've been trying to have. So that's one thing that I'm trying to sort of use to summarize this, because it's also with us. And that's why when in Lagos in last month in October, when people of the same age, people of the same background and all of that, well, not necessarily, exactly not of the same background, people of the same age, of the same city, and notionally all Nigerians, when they had to go out and fight and express their passion, it quickly broke down to the question of who is a criminal element, who is a hoodlum, and who is a legitimate protester. And these questions have never been fully resolved. I don't know that they are fully resolved, but I guess what I'm trying to sort of say is that I find that these issues are there in terms of how people, our panelists have spoken. And I just wanted to have people respond to this, or, I mean, I can pose a general question to everyone, but I guess that I'm really interested in hearing how, even now, some of these questions can be addressed, because, I mean, we cannot go back to what was happening in 1961 or 1966, Biafra and all of that. We can learn from them, which is the whole purpose of this. But, I mean, I'm just interested in how we can really, you know, use what we know individually and what we've been able to put together now to sort of respond to what's going on in Nigeria now, especially how things are broken down, and how even the same set of people who really hijacked class politics in Nigeria in the 60s, or the same people who are now really, you know, if you want, persecuting those who are sort of challenging the state, the way in which things are put together in Nigeria. So I'm asking individual presenters to maybe take a moment or two, think about this, and maybe respond as succinctly as possible.
I'll start. Hope you can all hear me. The important thing, I mean, it's a pity that we're talking to ourselves, but it's not a lost cause because we exist, I mean, within a bigger universe, which I'm sure we'll be able to transmit these same ideas to. I think the biggest thing we can go away from today is, you know, how to help shape, you know, the ongoing discussions, the ongoing struggles in Nigeria. And for me, what I see is that, as somebody just, I think it was Emeka, you know, that a lot of the conversations that are happening today happened in 1948, in 1958, in 1968. This cyclical nature of things, we should make it our big job today to stop it, to put a stop to it. And to be very honest, looking at the EndSARS movement, if I might call it that, and what has happened in the 2-3 weeks since the protests, I hope I'm not being pessimistic, but I might be. I already see that the same cycle repeating itself. What happened? What happened to the leftist movement in Nigeria? The left, you know, movement, you know, the people who shaped it in Nigeria of the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. I know KK, you know, doesn't agree with me when I say that a lot of what for most of the people there, for many of the people there, really they were just going into their middle class aspirations. You know, it was all mixed with the struggle for them. But a lot of it is true. And unfortunately, the state capitalized on that. And that is one of the reasons why the leftist movement, the Marxist movement, never grew in Nigeria, never grew. I'll give an example. In October of 1963, for example, the major labor unions then, and by the way, we always forget for a long that, you know, the NLC that we have today was created by the state, not by the labor movement people themselves. How did we get to that point in history where at a point, you know, in 1945, when there was the strike, then Iva Valley of, I believe, 1948 and all that, the leftists and the labor movement were a movement of workers by workers. How did we get to the point where the NLC was established by the state and, we like it or not, is an agency of the state? You know, and in 1963, for example, when there was the threat of a strike, all the major labor unions then formed the Joint Action Committee. And, you know, the Ministry of Labor and whatever else, you know, came in to discuss with them. They formed this Joint Action Committee. And when the Ministry of Labor came into discussion, they had series of discussions, you know, to prevent the strike. What was their core demand? Their core demand was that, oh, the pay gap, you know, for something that became known as the gap, because they said that the salaries of politicians and government officials was so high, and compared to that, or was 65% higher, I think they were saying then, than that of, you know, your junior level workers and all that. So all of by the way, the unions then included the Socialist Workers and Farmers Party, the Nigeria Trade Union Congress, the Nigeria Labour Party, and there was also the Nigeria Youth Congress, and many like that. But at the end of the day, all the other problems, you know, were fizzled down to just the problem salary. And when that happened, you know, it became a negotiation over, I'm sorry to say, middle class privileges. You know, and that is part of how the way was lost. Curtis Joseph, we're talking about him today because he thought he was a different thinker from all these other people. He refused, yes, to take a lot of the, you know, a lot of the opportunities, you know, that were flung to the major actors in the in the Marxist and leftist movement. He refused to take them because he could see that, yeah, a lot of this was just, you know, Trojan gifts of sorts, you know, and where it was going to lead to. But what he did was exemplary and courageous. But of course, it impoverished him. He too is like, we keep saying, whoa, I'm not taking a vow of poverty. Literally, he took a vow of poverty. Imagine, I mean, those of you who, a lot of us are indeed educating ourselves about Nigerian history and the major actors in it. Tanko Yakasai, for instance, who I got to read about during his exploits during the Second Republic and later. Imagine that in 1961, himself and Curtis Joseph were in the same movement, the same party, the same group. So you won't need to ask yourself what happened, you know, between then and the later Tanko Yakasai we know of, you know, and other people like that. The truth is that indeed, the movement was never, indeed, I'm sorry to say, it just wasn't grounded. There was no effort to reach out to, in a different way, you know, to other people. Let me go back to the example of Mrs. Ransome-Kuti, for instance. When Mrs. Ransome-Kuti was a part of the movement in Abeokuta that sent the Oba into exile, what happened? It was a movement of market women, of farmers, of traders, of artisans, you know, people who could not speak English, who had not been through the four walls of a school, who do not know where the Soviet Union is, or, you know, may have heard of London, certainly cannot locate it on a map. And what happened after then, after that dissipated? I mean, part of, you know, I understand what you are saying about people going to jail and all that for their views and for their struggles. You want to ask what happened to them? Why did they have that? Even the jail part of it, I'm sorry, was part of, you know, the carrot and stick measure of the state. I'll give you another example. To be able to travel outside Nigeria at that time, at all, you need a passport, of course. You know, those were the early days of the Nigerian passport. I don't know of, we all have had passport to travel out. When you go to get passport now, does anybody ask you to show your tax return? In those days, it was so. There were a lot of little obstacles that were placed in the path of people who even just want, it's not, you may not consider it a privilege, but then it was really a privilege, you know, to enjoy the little things that the state is supposed to provide. In those days, for you to kind of have any kind of relationship with workers and other people, leaders outside Nigeria, you can't but go through, you know, the ministries and all that. And once you get into the ministries, what they try to do is do everything to either coerce you or indoctrinate you, win you away from your your alternative thoughts, your thinking line, you know, which invariably is, you know, be it leftist or Marxist. They even made a person like Mrs. Ransome-Kuti. There was a point at which she refused to pay taxes because of, you know, You know all about the anti-tax wars and battles and struggle, you know. So I won't go into that here. But in 1957, for instance, when she was to go for the London conference, for one of the constitutional conference in London, you know, she was chosen, I think, by the NCNC to travel with them to London, but they wouldn't give her a passport because she refused. We paid her taxes, so she can get the passport. So there were a lot of other little coercive, you know, traits like that the state applied, and people are quizzed to, you know. And you ask yourself if instead of acquiescing all those little, you know, it starts with one little step and it goes on and on. You ask yourself if they really, I mean, why do you have to pay tax to get your passport? It's your right as a citizen, right? But those were the kind of things that, you know, were not done. And because they took those little steps, it became a part of what those of us who came after them inherited. It's not the subject of how all the labor unions got devolved into, were wiped out, and then the NLC was put in place to inherit their mantle. It's not a subject of this conversation. And anyway, I'm not an expert in that. KK, I'm sure you're listening, and you know more about this than I do. But the fact that we even allowed that to happen in history, the fact that it happened is what led to my organization, Women in Nigeria, dissipating, for example. Because once the state, you know, became interested in us, the first thing they tried to do was to, Miriam Babangida came, she approached, you know, she wanted us to change the name and name it the M team, the Miriam Babangida team, among other things. And we have all such kind of, you know, now, for example, we see that the NSAS, with the NSAS movement, you've had that the young people who were, you know, who have WhatsApp groups, you know, the NSAS WhatsApp, they are being arrested. You know, we heard that they are being arrested. You've heard of the vice president inviting them for a meeting and all that. And this was how it all started too, back then. You know, these subtle invitations and all that, and then, you know, the offers that then become the state taking over your mandate. Okay. So that is the lesson we need to pass on to.
Right. Okay, thank you. I mean, it's interesting as you started. You know, I was just thinking that there weren't many of us, and I was hoping that there will be questions from the floor. There aren't any, but I don't know. I mean, I expect others to pitch in, other presenters. Like KK, I can't see Emeka right now, and Hussein, I saw him earlier, but he's out. But so, KK, are you responding to that? What?
Can you hear me, Aki? Hello? Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
please, can you
about,
keep it like maybe like 2-3 minutes, and then
okay, yes, okay, yes, yeah. I just like to respond to the point you are raising about dialectics of a class and a nation, and to put it in a wider context. One of the things which the right, you know, the reactionaries have not been charitable enough to the old Soviet Union when they celebrate the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fact that, and I will also briefly relate this to the relevance of this to discussing Curtis Joseph, was that unlike the West, you know, that one of the greatest issues of democracy in the last century was the anti-colonial struggle. And history records say that it was the Soviet Union that supported that democratic movement, that of anti-colonial struggle, especially in Africa, you know, and elsewhere, you know. Now, and it was in the context, you know, of that, you know, ideological, you know, historical disposition of Soviet Union to Africa. It was in that particular historical context that the Curtis Joseph of this world, you know, emerged. That you even have the idea of the national, I mean, the talking of the Lenin Peace Prize, you know, and the rest would happen. Now, Curtis Joseph, you know, couldn't have perhaps, you know, imagine the way he imagined ideologically, you know, if they did not have that kind of attitude, you know, to Africa, you know, and it was then following the footsteps of Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou, you know, and the rest. That's dialectics you see there in the contemporary. You know, today when you discuss the national question, you talk about the possible breakup of Nigeria, restructuring, recasting in Nigeria, is that tension in between the issue and is an issue which historically confronted Marxists. That there is no record that you have got a definitive answer. You know, for example, what happened immediately after the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989. You know, all the segregation you have in Eastern Europe, it was the play out of that particular dialectics. So I'm just trying to tell you that the theme that you have identified is still a very relevant theme, and it's also relevant to the story of Curtis Joseph, as we are telling that it's only in that wider context that you could have it, and that is what we'll be having in Nigeria. You know, during the time of the Curtis Joseph generation, and even the contemporary generation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much. This is helpful, really, because you know it's always the question of how much support or how much like truly conscious effort the Soviet Union to support anti-colonial movements. Because as I said, there was this tension between when figures, black figures like George Padmore, C.L.R. James were raising the colonial question. At that time, of course, this was in the 30s, things may have changed, but often for that, they came back really and did in a very progressive way support the movement. Of course, the Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou made of their national aspiration and how we're connected.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. I don't know. Okay. The internet connection just went funny.
No, was it? Because even the record is still on.
Oh, okay. So, but did you hear? I mean, do you have anything to add?
Okay, so the last bit I heard was when you were trying to ask, or when you posed the question about nationalism and class. If I heard.
Well, I mean, in a sense, Comrade KK answered that and basically said, then brought up the question of how that question was present there and now it's still present now. I mean, I'm interested in what you were saying, especially in relation to the economic question of the balance of payments, how Badioni model responded to that, and whether there is in fact any way to connect that to what's going on now. Because what I heard from you is also the same thing, the idea that although that was an issue back then, that it still has a great deal of relevance now. And I thought that there might be ways of connecting that with what Said was saying about party politics, but he's not here. And so it's really quite frustrating that much of what he said,
I am here. Hi, this is Said.
Oh, okay, is that you?
Yeah, I've been here the entire time. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, when I saw Lagos Book Fair. So can you guys just try to respond to this? I mean, to be very honest with you, I heard much of what you said, but I couldn't really connect it with what you started with. So to be very frank with you, I'm quite at a loss. But I did know that you were posing some questions about the contemporaneity of those issues that were taking place in the 60s, especially with the NPP, and how we might think of that in relation to now. So I guess I'm just interested, maybe opportunistically, in having you guys sort of tie these in, because really we're in history now. And there's a lot. You guys have also made efforts to try to respond to what's going on. So I just want you to try to bring what you've said about the context, okay, in which Curtis Joseph did the work that he did, especially in terms of really raising consciousness, whether in terms of party politics or about trying some kind of entrepreneurial effort, to what's going on now. I mean, if, you know, the NSAS people have means that cannot be policed or surveilled by the government through bank, you know, and all of that, you know, people seizing passport, if there are those things. So I'm saying that on one hand, we have the question of the class dimension, the fact that these people need to be grounded, and we don't have to make a distinction in these bourgeois way between criminal elements and real protesters on one hand. And on the other hand, that, you know, there's also the question of not so much visibility, but credibility of leftist movement. By credibility, I mean being able to actually earn your pay, being able to really generate your own resources. So I thought that you guys might actually be able to respond to that, you know, that it is not just Jack or Zuckerberg who can control the means through which we can actually struggle this. And what are those means? You know, I mean, again, one thing that I noticed from Edima Dunagu's tributes, I didn't quote that part, was the fact that he actually thought of Curtis Joseph as being, so to speak, a not successful businessman. And I think that that's interesting, you know, I mean, not businessman in the bourgeois sense, but at least of somebody who actually made an attempt to try to create a means of carrying his struggle forward, independent of the machinations of the state as such. So I guess I'm just interested in this other dimension, the economic context for actually, you know, developing a critique or or organizing that the state cannot police the way it has been maybe season passport of Mochiville, you know, Modupe or délé, or doing something to Renu and all of that. So that's really what I'm trying to say. So I'm saying that both, yeah.
Okay, so let me take a quick stab at it. I think what I'm trying to say in essence was that part of what the process of decolonization was geared to achieve in Nigeria in this instance was that it was supposed to take power, hand power, political power to Nigerians, to a certain class of Nigerians at the time, which were well cultured and bred, and then the British knew exactly what they were doing with that group of people, and that part. But on a larger scale, they kept economic power for themselves. And don't forget that it was sometime around 1945 that you started to see multilaterals like the World Bank and all of that. It was an economic kind of shift where they knew that if these people had their interests, I mean, the local elites now who they had planted in power had their business interests as far as that they could do the job of the middleman and they got kickbacks, they would always represent their interests. And that's how you have seen capitals, and today all the neoliberals begin to talk about foreign direct investments, portfolio investments, and all sorts of jargon. You know, where, you know, and this is something that Buddy says, that for you to understand how you have continually been made to underdevelop, because at the end of the day, the two strands of development are always going on. So one, the metropolitan, you know, in the metropoles, you're having growth in development, but here you're having underdevelopment, because this is how the system was rigged to work in the first place. Things have always gone bad. So from all of that time in the 1960s, when we got what Buddy calls flag independence, for instance, is that things kept going increasingly bad. So we got to the point in the 1980s where we got into the SAP, and then it got worse. And then we started to see what you call a proliferation of the informal sector. Now, Nigeria is largely an informal sector, which is why you look at not just the indices that support unemployment, but those that support underemployment. You know, perhaps I'm even one of those people who fall into that category of being underemployed. You know, maybe not unemployed, but underemployed. So it's a very tricky situation, and then it's hard not to look at it. I mean, and Saeed and I have had these conversations privately and even with other people present, where it's hard not to look at the whole NSAS movement and think about, you know, the class analysis.
Okay, maybe that's the moment for Said to pitch in, so that, because we have been told that we have 4 minutes to go. So sorry about that.
Okay.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's a huge topic, and I guess it spans across history. We're only talking about the aspect of history that, of course, concerns Curtis Joseph, so the anti-colonial period and the First Republic. But if we're trying to understand the wider history of the trajectory of the left that brings us to EndSARS, of course, it's a much longer conversation than the rest of the time allotted can permit. So, I think what Emeka said about kind of neocolonialism and the economic dimension of what's happened to Nigeria is critical. But I think what I was trying to highlight there in my presentation, and I think what's often missing from these conversations about the trajectory of ideology in Nigeria, is the dominance and success of conservative ideologies in Nigeria since the anti-colonial movement. Even if there have been some brief interregnums or moments when they have seemed like, when the left has seemed to be prominent or to have sparks of hope. So I think the start of the anti-colonial struggle, of course, was propelled by a leftist vanguard. That's where people like Curtis Joseph emerged from. We know that. But then there was a conservative backlash. The anti-colonial movement, I think, should be understood not simply as an outgrowth of that sort of vanguardist movement initially, but also of the rise of conservative forms of ethno-nationalism. The MPC represented this, I think, most directly, but even within the welfarist tradition here in the Southwest, there was a battle for the soul of kind of what that tradition represented, and what it now looks like today in the form of the APC, which calls itself the All Progressives Congress, trying to put on the cloak of that previous progressive coalition, right? But it looks quite dramatically different from the welfarists of that period, and rather, looks a lot more like the conservative forms of Yoruba ethno-nationalism that sprung up at various points in the First, and Second Republics. So if we're trying to trace the trajectory of the left or the decline of class-based perspectives on politics and the rise of non-class kinds of nationalisms, both on the kind of pan-ethnic level and at the sort of ethnic level, I think that story has to be told with reference also to the rise of conservative movement and the success of the conservative movement in the country. And it was a success that was strengthened by the colonial state in various ways through its institutionalization of ethnic federalism. Of course, because various other kinds of federalism are imaginable. We could have split up the country on the basis of various productive units. Okay, this is the mining state, but we sort of created federalism on the basis of, either real or imagined pre-colonial state identities and ethnicities. So, I think that reinforced the strength of movements that were organized on that basis. And these are the conservative movements that have taken power. And through the military interregnum and the imposition of that authoritarian form of austerity through, structural adjustment in the 80s, we now have the merger of a neoliberal ideology with our own homegrown conservative movement that has been more or less dominant since its resurgence in the anti-colonial movement. So I think that's like a central part of the story that if you remove it from the picture, then it just looks, like sort of a weakened left who lacked the imagination or the initiative or weren't sort of holy enough. But I think that doesn't tell the story adequately. So maybe I'll leave it there in the interest of time. Thank you.
Nice tone to end, and I really appreciate your support and response to this, because it is really very interesting that we're able to have this in terms of the relationship between our own context, the fact that we couldn't do this physically, but that we can actually do it. So that's one, the fact that technological possibilities allowed us to do this, but also, and this is really very important, that at least over nearly 2 decades after he passed away, and certainly 100 years after he was born, that we still have memory of these Nigerian patriots to be able to really make irrespective of the fact that maybe not all of us, maybe a KK had a personal contact with him. I never did. So I guess I'm just interested in these two dimensions. The fact that what that really tells us is that, I mean, the simple way to say is that the struggle continues, of course, but that it's really a very important thing that we have this memory and that we're actually able to bring together ideas that we really, a year ago, weren't even sure could cohere. So that to me is a very positive thing, and I'm really very proud and thankful to you individuals, and really grateful that you were able to respond to this and bring your individual expertise and knowledge and passion to this. So it's actually a good thing, and it's money yet on Creation Day. So things may not look right for Nigeria or for progressive elements in Nigeria, but it's never deep. It's never done. But that really hasn't dampened our energy. And it is really very interesting that at every point in Nigerian history, it is people who are really interested in the masses of the people, in the betterment of the masses of the people, who are actually pushing things forward, and that's a good thing. And so on that note, I would say that it's actually good, we're doing very well. We are actually going to get there. We don't know when, but Comrade Lenin says that just do it, and we'll continue to do it and keep hope alive. So thank you very much. I'm really very impressed, and thank you. And again, thanks to LABAF people for making this possible, giving us extra this platform, and also staying with us. So thank individuals. I'm grateful to see, good to see Uncle Kyle here to be listening to us. So thanks. And I'll ask you at some point, because we also need to have a drinks. And so it's good. Thank you very much. Jaman, Toyi, Ladi, KK, everyone else, thank you. And if you want to say something in closure, Jaman, I'm happy to.
Yeah, well,
thank you.
Just to say thank you to everybody. We're very glad.
Thank you too.
When this particular event came to us via Adishoko, we're not sure how to handle it, but we know that Joseph was not well known to a lot of people. But from the comment we gathered from here, even from Odia, the fact that he know him, and we were joking that anyone that Odia does not know, that person does not exist. We all learned a lot, and we're happy that we're recording. We're going to use this recording for new books. I've just seen my publisher there, Ehib Brahima, the latest publisher in town. Thank you very much, everybody, for and thank you for pulling this through. You know the journey that you have to undertake. Where's Ladi? Mama Ladi? Yeah. Odia was waiting to say hello to you. She just stepped downstairs now because she was waiting not to say hello to you. And KK, thank you very much. Everybody.
Thank you. Say hello.
Thank you. He nice to see you.
Me too. How are you?
Now, fine, thank you.
Long time.
Same weekly.
Long time.
Showbiz.
Where is Odia Femo? Odia Femo is my big uncle. Though.
No, he just went downstairs now. He just left the room. Yes. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody.
Okay. All right. I salute you.
Thank you. We'll continue tonight. We have
thank you, KK.
Okay, thank you, Joaquin. Okay, yeah. Ladi.
All right.
Ladi is still there. Ladi.
He's still there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Big man. I got to them.
Okay.
Good night.
All right.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Take care. All right. Take care now.
All right. Good night.